Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the iPhone 8 and see how this specific iPhone holds up in 2023. Now, this iPhone is a very interesting device because last year there was so much development with it. This was probably one of the most interesting iPhones, or one of the iPhones that just randomly got kind of popular. There were so many different moments where the iPhone 8 in particular were trending last year, which was very interesting on Twitter. But a big thing is that with iOS 16, this iPhone ended up being third in place of being discontinued to now being the oldest supported iPhone on iOS 16. It's pretty crazy how much a year can actually impact an iPhone, especially when Apple discontinues two different iPhones at the same time. Now, in this case, what I'll tell you is maybe I wouldn't recommend the iPhone 8 in 2023, but there are some other iPhones I would recommend buying, and if you want to pick them up, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the exterior and the outside of the iPhone 8, on the front, we had a 4.7-inch Retina IPS panel. Now, the one thing I've kind of stated about this panel, even since day one, it's not a bad panel. It's just a lot of bezel surrounding it. This phone actually came out the same time as the iPhone 10 back in 2017. And we all know with the iPhone 10, that iPhone looks, very, very modern still, but the iPhone 8 still looks very outdated. The only thing going for the iPhone 8, I would say, in a body standpoint now, is that because Apple made the iPhone as the third generation in 2022 just last year, this has kind of made this iPhone feel a little bit more newer, I guess, because most people will look at the iPhone SE 3 that just came out last year, not even a year old, and the iPhone 8, and they would kind of say they look kind of the same and they're almost the same phone, so that's kind of more of a compliment to the iPhone 8 than it is for the iPhone SE 3. We still have the home button on the front too, which is okay, and nothing else really on the front. On the bottom, we have that lightning port, which I think is pretty cool. Having that lightning port is awesome. So looking like it's going to be switching to USB-C soon, but regardless, very good still. And on the back, we have this standard glass back. Now, the thing with this phone in general, as I've talked about for a long period of time now, is that overall, you're still getting a lot of cool features that are still fairly modern. You're getting a glass back, which is very important for an iPhone, I would say. It makes it feel way more premium. You're getting wireless charging, you're getting IP certification, and overall, those are some really big things. And you're still getting 3D touch on that front screen too, which is actually kind of a nice feature. So on the outside, although it doesn't really look like the latest and greatest iPhone anymore, I still don't think it feels like a super cheap iPhone. It may not look the best, but it still feels like a kind of like a premium iPhone. So there's not really too much to kind of complain about it in that standpoint. So on the outside, I think it kind of gets a thumbs up for me, but it does look a little bit dated on the front. Now in the camera department, this iPhone has a single 12 megapixel wide-angle lens on the back and a 7 megapixel camera on the front. Now, the one thing I've been kind of talking about with this specific phone, probably for the last few years now, was actually with the camera. So this was, I think, one of not the ways Apple dropped the ball with this iPhone, but I would say it's one of those things that's either kind of like, it's just a very interesting camera. We have a 4K at 60 camera on the back, 1080p at 30 on the front. And back in 2017, it really wasn't that bad of a camera. I think it was actually pretty good. You are missing things like portrait mode, which was pretty much on a majority of iPhones at that moment. So it was very weird Apple didn't bring it on this phone. But the interesting thing is when I look at this camera and I compare it to the iPhone SE 3 that Apple made last year, almost exactly the same sensor. You're getting the same resolution, same megapixel count, pretty much the same everything. So that is the more interesting part. I think the iPhone 8 in 2023 holds up better, but I think the camera itself is the one area which is starting to show its age. If you're not really expecting the craziest camera, then I think this thing is okay for the most part. But again, you're not getting ultra-wide camera, you're not getting a telephoto lens, you're not getting portrait mode, cinematic mode, stabilization mode, 4K at 60 on the front. There is a lot of stuff that this phone is missing. But if you don't care about really any of the things that I just mentioned, then I think you're going to be okay, and there's really not too much of a reason to go and, freak out about it. But again, just one of those small things to keep in mind. Now, moving on past the camera, we do have the software and the longevity of this specific iPhone. Now, the thing to keep in mind with the iPhone 8 is that this is an iPhone, like I mentioned, last year was third in place of being discontinued. We had the iPhone 7 and iPhone 6s that were also being supported on iOS 15. Apple went ahead and discontinued both of those iPhones on iOS updates at the same time, which was pretty crazy. So now this iPhone is pretty much the oldest supported iPhone on iOS 16. So I don't know how much longer this phone is going to last. I have a feeling that it's not going to be discontinued on iOS 16, but I have absolutely no insider information. I have no way to verify anything. So, your guess is just as good as mine, but I would probably say that potentially with the iPhone 8, because it, is following suit with the iPhone 10 and iPhone 8 Plus, I feel like they wouldn't end it right after the iPhone 8. I mean, there's been lots of times Apple would go ahead and support an iPhone much longer than its previous generation. And in this case, I mean, I would probably say that the iPhone, 8 could do something like an iPhone 5, where it ended up lasting longer than its previous generation, even though it was like an S series. The iPhone XS I could see lasting a little bit longer, but regardless, I don't think the iPhone 8 is going to be ending off on iOS 16, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be getting iOS 15, meaning this phone, or it's going to be getting iOS 17, meaning this phone is going to last all the way throughout this year, and it's going to last next year as well, probably. So I guess we're going to have to wait and see what happens, but in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now moving on to the performance side of things, like I mentioned before, this iPhone, same chipset as the iPhone 10 and iPhone 8 Plus, it has that Apple A11 Bionic chip inside of it. And the one thing that I've kind of been mentioning about this phone, probably for the last few years now, is, in my opinion, how good of an iPhone this thing was in the performance segment. Although it really wasn't the best performing phone of that time, the chipset in this phone really isn't that bad. Of course, it's not as fast as the iPhone 14 Pros, and the RAM obviously isn't as good as the latest iPhones, but for an old phone, it's still quite surprising how good of an iPhone this thing was. The main constraints, I would say, for the most part, isn't even with the chipset, which is the weird thing. It's actually with the, home button design. So with the home button, you have to go and click the home button for the apps to close and minimize. This is the problem with all these home button iPhones. If you compare it to something like an iPhone 10, iPhone XS, 11, 12, every iPhone after that, basically for the most part, you are getting that gesture-based design, which means that you're actually going through, and it's so much of a smoother process. It feels like you're actually interacting with the apps and moving things out of the way and multitasking, all that stuff. With the iPhone 8, you don't really get that. So you have to keep waiting for these, applications to close, and you have to wait for so much. It's a much slower feeling phone, even though it has the same chipset as the iPhone 10. So that's the problem. Even with the iPhone 8 Plus, I felt the exact same way about that phone too. So I think if you're playing games like Genshin Impact, whatnot, those games, you're going to be okay because you can tailor down the graphics. But if you're trying to play the highest graphic settings on all these games, you're definitely going to be running into some constraints. The screen size is also a little bit smaller compared to phones nowadays. So you might be feeling like you can't see as much or whatever. But in my opinion, I think the performance is still okay. You kind of know what you're getting, but I just don't like the home button that much anymore, if I'm being honest. So in terms of that kind of covers it up. In the battery life department, this thing didn't really have a massive size battery, 1,821 milliamp-hours. Definitely not that big anymore, but I think it's about the same size as the iPhone SE3, so it's not really that big of a difference anyway. And to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I will tell you is, I think the iPhone 8 is still a pretty good iPhone. I think it still has some capability behind it. My only thing is that if you're planning on buying this iPhone, you have to really be either on a super, budget constraint, or you have to be, coming from an iPhone 5. If you're coming from a super old iPhone, even older than the iPhone 8, then I would say, okay, whatever, go for it. But at the very least, I'd probably recommend going for an iPhone 10. That iPhone is going to be giving me a much better experience, and that probably makes a lot more sense to me than getting an iPhone 8. Probably the same thing for an iPhone 11 or 10R. Any of those iPhones make way more sense than the iPhone 8 in my opinion. So in terms of that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.